Good morning and a very warm welcome to all of you, our Zoom audience and our live stream audience. My name is Dharmendra Kanani. I'm the moderator for this session on designing for inclusion, how urban planning can make or break a city. A very timely debate in these COVID times. Before I say a few words of introduction to the debate, let me just engage and set out how we're going to engage with you and the rules of engagement are. So firstly on Zoom, a very warm welcome to you. Make sure that your video is on, your name is there, and that you're on mute. And also make sure that you're able to, when you want to raise a question or an issue, use your virtual hand. Your virtual hand you'll find under the icon where it says participants. If you click on that, you'll be able to find out that you can put your hand up, and then actually we will notice you, and then we'll be able to take you in and bring you in for the question, a query, or an issue you want to raise. Our live stream audience, you're not left out. A very warm welcome to you also. What I encourage you to do is make sure you use the Twitter handle, #FOEdebate, to post your question, query, or frustration. And we will make sure that we are taking you into this discussion also as a part of this journey of conversation around urban planning. So that's the rules of engagement, if you will. Just a few words. We have a number of very interesting speakers who are, I suppose, on the ground, if you like, from this. There isn't a politician in sight, which is quite rare for a Friends of Europe debate. This is about looking at what do we have to think about, what do we need to do, and how do we plan for the future when we are thinking about urban planning? It's quite interesting that when we think about inclusion and what that means in terms of city design and urban planning, it's interesting that nearly every single city that's been designed and built has been by a man. Not a single woman has been involved. And we know, according to the Financial Times, that about 10% of women occupy senior positions in architectural firms or in the actual profession itself. But we know that some women mayors are doing the right thing. So, for example, we know in Barcelona that the mayor there is looking at a different approach to creating super blocks and turning over spaces for pedestrian traffic. We also know Anne Hidalgo is trying to push the notion in Paris of the 15-minute city, which involves making sure that actually communities have everything within their reach within 15 minutes. But what we know about this crisis, and what we know historically, is that inclusion is something that is very little thought of, and majority of those who design and plan and construct our cities often do not represent the communities that cities serve, not only women, minorities, but a whole range of communities. And the question here is, could it be made better if we had a different mindset, a different approach to designing for inclusion? What does that mean, really? And what are the practical steps? And does it have an impact? And does it make a difference to people's lives? Those of you who know, who've actually been in major cities across the world, will know that very quickly, that regardless of which part of the world you're in, you know where poor people live. They're in the poorest housing, the poorest infrastructure, and you can tell, usually you can tell by public transport. When you go traveling, for example, in Brussels, London, Paris, Berlin, elsewhere, you go from one end of the line to the other, and you go from wealth to extreme poverty. It's quite interesting with actually how our metro maps and our public systems really eloquently illustrate where poverty lies in a city and how it's been designed in such a way. And we know from flows of migration and where refugees are housed or migrant communities have historically been housed, we know there's a kind of pattern that certain areas become the areas where communities come in, start to cope. When they thrive, they move out, etc. So we're into this conversation about how do we design for inclusion, or inclusion for designing urban places. I want to turn to our first speaker, Hannah. Hannah, tell us, you're a research fellow. You're in Barcelona. Tell us, what is, from your perspective, in a short. I mean, most of us have known what's happened to cities in that. Rather than being a leveller, the virus, which people thought earlier on, what's really happened is it's actually sharpened, deepened and widened inequalities that were already there. It's almost like how the virus has tackled those with underlying conditions and exposed them to greater risk. We've seen that happen in cities. Briefly touch upon what's actually happening, but more important, and people would want to hear about what action should cities take. Hannah, over to you. Very warm welcome.
Hi, good morning, everybody, and thank you for the warm welcome, Damendra, and this introduction. Yes, I think COVID-19 is a major challenge to the inclusiveness of our cities, but it's also an opportunity. So we all know the pandemic has produced a social emergency that is concentrated in cities and that, as you just mentioned, is manifest in rising inequalities. So it's really the most vulnerable and disadvantaged neighborhoods and groups that have been hit hardest by the pandemic, and also its socioeconomic impacts. These groups have had to face lockdowns in smaller and more precarious housing. They have less secure jobs. Often these are essential jobs that require them to leave the house. They have less access to information, green spaces, essential services, and so on. And unless effective strategies are put in place to address these issues, COVID-19 will leave us with more fragmented cities. But as you already hinted at, local authorities are already acting. And in recent weeks and months, we've often heard this phrase, cities on the front line. It's been all over the press and in webinars like this one. And what this phrase really encapsulates is how cities have been thrown back on themselves and have to formulate solutions. But often these solutions have been quite innovative, actually. And they are addressing urgent on-the-ground problems. And it is in these solutions or actions where I see an opportunity for making our cities more inclusive. And I briefly want to highlight 3 areas of action in which there have been strong efforts to make our cities more inclusive. And the first is urban design. I won't dwell much on this, as there are other speakers on this panel who have much more expertise in this than me. But COVID-19 has driven efforts to make our cities more healthy and livable. Many cities have taken green urban planning measures in response to the pandemic that have changed public space, have changed how we move around our cities. And often these measures are associated with what has become known as the 15-minute city approach, which you already mentioned. And this is spearheaded by Paris, but is now also being adapted by cities like Milan and other cities in Europe, but across the world as well. And what this 15-minute concept really includes is the creation of more bike lanes, wider sidewalks, the pedestrianization of streets and entire neighborhoods, the reappreciation of proximity, local businesses, green spaces, etc. And inclusion is often at the heart of these measures. A second area I want to highlight is how there has been a stepping up of public services in fields where local authorities have competencies. And these include education, housing, social services for the most vulnerable, cultural inclusion, support for local businesses, and many others. And I'm happy to give some concrete examples of what measures cities have taken in these areas later on in the discussion.
Great.
And finally, I would like to make a final point. The final area I would like to highlight is the co-production of solutions with civil society, which have promoted inclusiveness in the management of the pandemic. And at CDOB, the think tank I'm based in, we recently published a report on how cities across the world have been managing the pandemic. And many authors have stressed how non-state actors and specifically civil society have stepped in to complement and fill the gaps in government action. And here we have really seen how groups and individuals have been given a voice in the management of the pandemic. And these are groups and individuals that are often not heard. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much for that. And that's really helpful. And I think people have noticed and people have commented that with the lockdowns, you know, it's outside is breathable. The sound is better. You know, there's a real impact on the kind of, let's say, the green element, that sense of peace in our cities. And as you say, it's interesting to know what you've said, but what I would like to hear, and I think others would like to hear over this discussion, and those of you, this is not about, we don't do a usual Q&A with a panel, this is about all of you, all your brains working together to discuss some of these points. Is what about poverty and inequality? how is, what's happening to those areas which are entrenched with disadvantage, and what kind of evaluation do we have of what cities are doing now? Is anyone looking at that? Is there some sort of Europe-wide look at how this pandemic is helping cities to be better? But that's what I'll come back to you. What I'd recommend all of you to do, please, is use the chat function. So if you've got a question, if you've got an issue, if you've got a response to what I've just said, use the chat function, note it down, or if you've got resources or ideas, please, because that means that we can document it, collect it, and then actually feed it back in different fora. I want to move on to Tao. Tao, you're editor, founder of a magazine called Cityscapes, and you have this overview through your I think your biannual publication. What I want to hear from you, if I may, and welcome for joining us, is we know that this is this crisis is changing cities fundamentally in such different ways. It's also having this, as you said, what Hannah was saying, there is a social emergency. It's changing how we are interacting. Tell us, what's the opportunity? So how's it changing? But comment very briefly on what you see as been the major changes. But that's very brief. But I'm more interested in, how is there an opportunity here, which sounds a terrible thing to say, an opportunity to really rethink and redo urban planning?
I think, yes, Demetri. I think there is an opportunity, absolutely. But as much as there is an opportunity, it will also go the other way, because we are on this uneven, fluid ground right now where no one can really tell how all this ends. To sort of go back to, for me, the biggest impact of COVID so far has been what it surfaced. It surfaced everything that you mentioned in the beginning and some of what Hannah alluded to. So all the stuff that was sort of like hidden underneath the surface, or the illusions we have had about how our cities work or how our systems work, have sort of like been upended in many ways. So I think this is what we have to focus on, like how and why those systems failed. And we can talk about inclusivity, and we can really think about how we become more inclusive if we have really, I think, sort of got to the heart of these failures. And I also would like to add that before we can even get to the question of inclusivity, we have to think, why have certain places and certain cities not been inclusive in the first place? So I think we have to sort of like have an honest reflection on that. So the point I would like to make mostly to start us off is that there are some tough questions that we all need to ask ourselves, but also that the opportunity is lost if we just stay and try to act on the edges of the systems that are clearly need a bit of a retooling. In my conversations I'm having with various people in different parts of the world, most places haven't changed because they have not the capacities to, and they haven't had the time to actually even think about change. They're just handling what's at hand right now. So, yeah, I will stop there to kick us off.
So it would be good to, if you can post anything where you see things changing. I think that all of us are conversant with what the issues are. It's like we're very good at describing and deconstructing the problem, but very low at what the solutions might be. And that's not a criticism of any of us. It's just the way our mentality has been. And it's like cities. In my experience, they reflect the experience of instability across the world, a history of colonization, if you like, and movements of people. And what we do know is our cities have been reflected that history, and where the pockets of migration occupy certain cities, and it's been ever thus across the world. But there's something about cities not being shock absorbent. They're not structured to respond to shock, but also we don't have the kind of mindset about the fact that if you live in a middle class area, you've got parks, you've got nice design, you're able to really enjoy yourself. If you're in a poor area, in a very, very tight housing block, you know that safety matters to you, for your kids to play out, and all sorts of other things. But it'd be good to hear from people. And don't be shy, people. This is not about, you being passive observers to this debate. I do encourage you. Put your hands up. So we can engage with you. There's such a diverse audience out there. It'll be so good to hear from you, some of your experiences, so we can garner and gather some of these views out there. So I encourage you, put your virtual hands up so I can bring you in. Otherwise, I'll just pick on you, which will not be nice, I know. But hey, we need to move things forward. I want to move on to our third contributor, and that's Noor. Noor, you're an architect, urban researcher. And you founded this organization called Urbanism, and I think it's interesting and it's very useful to bring you in because people don't think about this issue in the context of Syria, and I think for us it would be really interesting to hear what are the social justice dimensions of, let's say, urban inclusive design or urban planning. Hi, warm welcome to you.
I'm really happy to be with you today. Yeah, it's very important to speak about the social justice in the context of reconstruction, because today in Syria we are not talking about that really at all. The whole reconstruction policies has already started several years ago, and they are just focusing on it's more in exclusive policies than in inclusive policies, because they are just focusing on a partnership between the private sector and the government and making profit until now. And the whole inclusivity is just out of the picture, unfortunately, until now, because the people are not involved in the process.
Mm-hmm.
And urbanism is more focusing on engaging more the civil society in that by breaking down the technicality of the reconstruction. So we are trying to do informatic video on making all of these legal situations and the policies. We are breaking down into a simple language so the people could also understand that and then start to engage. Because when you are not informed, you would either assume that you are not, these policies wouldn't meet you, or you just ignore it because you're just frustrated and you cannot react based on that. And what we are trying to do is just break all of this complexity of these coming policies, just so the people would understand, be informed, and then try to engage based on real information and also false news and so.
And so one of the key things you're saying is about making sure you include civil society, but also make the information, democratize information. So information is power in a way. So how do you kind of bring that together? How are you finding, there's two issues that occur to me. That point I made about the fact that, as an architect, you're a woman architect. Has it been really tough for you to access the industry? And also, given the context in which you're working, how's that made it more difficult?
Well, yes and no. In the Syrian context, women architects are really involved in the scene, but they are not in the power. They are still, as only architects, they are not in the power positions until now, let's say, or they are not so represented there. And yes, it has been challenging because I work also in a field where only men are in power. I'm also practicing architecture in Germany, in Berlin,
Mm-hmm.
where it's a completely different context for me.
In what way? Is it better, the Berlin context? Or is the power dynamics of, maleness in the world of architecture and also in politics and elsewhere, is it because Berlin is often thought of nowadays as the Renaissance city, in Europe. It's like it's changing so much about its civic engagement, about its power structures, about its inclusion, voting on issues. It's seen as like this breath of fresh air of doing democracy differently. Is that so, from your perspective?
It is so, yes. I think it's a completely different context from the Syrian context. Where I work, it's really dominated by women, let's say, now, or it's more balanced. And here, the more focus is only on finding new solutions by everybody. And it's a more cooperative context where all stakeholders are working together in order to find solution. There's always this reflection process where you re-evaluate what you have proposed before when you see that it's not really working or functioning, and then you go back and forward. And it's not this a classical way of top-down thinking.
Uh-huh.
It's more a dialogue, and it's a
Sure.
livable dialogue.
And
And
if I can stay with you, sorry to cut across, people often comment on the fact of, that inclusion is about making sure citizens have a voice and they have not only just consulted, but across the whole process from design to decision and build. How often is the conversation about inclusion, i.e., what do we do about poverty? What do we do about women's safety? What do we do about children? What do we do about minorities? And creating a very different kind of space. Is that something which is heard? Is it discussed from the beginning, or is it something you have to kind of really push the door on to get a conversation around?
yeah, I can speak from the practice now. For example, now the government is trying always to start with a phase where the people are engaged from the beginning in planning their neighborhood
Right.
or upgrading it. So the whole work is they just added a new phase in the projects where people are engaged really from the beginning. There's many workshops. There's a lot of working with on the field with the people, engaging them, discussing with them, asking them what they are from their experience and from their living in this neighborhood. How do they reflect on the planning? The problem is again there is understanding the technicality. So we as architects or urban planners are being the medium who have to translate all the technicality and legalization and policies to the people, because most of the people would be there when they are just for the first time engaging in such projects. They just talk about a flower pot that they want to have there, or a small green area, or a playground, or so.
Of course.
They're not really engaged. They just would like to take care of their own space, what they're surrounding by, and the role of architects or urban planners is really being developed in this area, where you have to bring the discussion to the people and then get the discussion back to the table with the decision makers. This medium, this moderating of such discussion is being also part of the main part of the role.
Yeah, and I can imagine some of the kind of old guard architectural firms will be thinking, what? Really? That's crazy. But that's the point of inclusive design, and also about almost a sense of feminist architectural practice, or a feminism, or a different approach, as we've seen in, when we think about even like foreign policy. People talked about feminist foreign policy, which takes a very different view and shaking things up in the same way about, I think, when we think about urban design, how do we shake things up from a different perspective? Because actually that creates a different dynamic for all groups, because you're not just thinking about one, you actually open up a different space. Thank you very much, Noor. I'm glad we have some hands up, and I want to bring some people in. Rosina Spinoy, a very warm welcome to you.
Hi there, thank you.
Hello.
It's nice to be here.
Good, welcome.
Very interesting discussion.
Tell us, introduce yourself and what your question or issue is.
Yeah. I'm Rosina Spinoy. I run the improvement districts here in Belgium and also part of the European Placemaking Network.
Lovely Scottish accent there. Sorry, I couldn't resist. I've spent on my heels in Edinburgh and Glasgow, so sorry, I'm just welcoming that. Sorry, audience, I just had to respond to that. Go on, carry on.
No, that's okay. No, I was going to just bring up the topic of inclusion, that it's also the sort of intersectionality of it, and also, as well as obviously the sort of gender aspect, there's also, I think, the accessibility aspect for people with disabilities and how we make our spaces accessible for all at that level. And certainly, I think during this period, as we've mentioned, we've seen that, of course, there's a huge divide, that COVID has brought about. I mean, at all different aspects, I think, of community, including education, also for those that are vulnerable. And so I was just going to ask and sort of pose the question of, inclusion in the greater aspect, that not just on the sort of socioeconomic scale, but also as I said, for the accessibility factor for people with disabilities, etc., because there's a lot of spaces that are not inclusive on that aspect. And I think cities and communities need to do so much more in that. And also
Absolutely.
really our, we talk about participation. Now, it's not just about, I think, local governments to have participatory one-off sessions.
Mm-hmm.
It's keeping that narrative going,
Mm-hmm.
I think, and keeping people involved in
Yeah.
that narrative.
Yeah.
Because I've seen a lot of the participatory sessions where let's gather everybody and then, everyone gives feedback, but there's no follow-up on what's actually been realised out of that, what has affected policy, and how can we be more anticipatory also, where we're actually using a little bit of foresight.
Rosina, thank you. Very, very welcome comments. And it would be good to know from you, not necessarily in response to this right now, but even if we put it on the Zoom chat, where have you seen this happen that's effective? And you're right, it's almost as if you're pointing to the fact we need a different model of governance and democratic engagement, which is not the one-hit wonder in a crisis or when you want an election time, but actually make it part of the mindset of how you do business. From year to year, month to month, and have it in your mindset actually inclusion, engagement, a follow-up, and actually we make better decisions when you involve people that have that kind of mindset. I want to bring in, and thank you for that, and those of you who are continuing to raise your hands, please do. It's good to know that you are engaging with us in this conversation. I want to bring in our fourth and final contributor. And that's a perspective from Vienna, a city that has, done a number of things to be safer, inclusive. It's had an advisor. We have the political advisor here with us, Kurt. Very warm welcome to you. Obviously, the sadness of all our feelings are around what happened, which created a very different temperature and climate of an unsuspected sense of what took place in Vienna. Tell us a little bit about what the reaction has been in the context of this agenda of inclusive design or designing for inclusion, because you've done you've been there for many years. You've done some incredible things. So share with us some of the aspects that you feel have worked. But what has this most recent incident done and impacted on a city such as Vienna? Gott, over to you, and a very warm welcome.
Hello, thank you very much for invitation and all the contributions I could hear until now. So, in the first moment, the society was shocked about what happened, and in the second step, so I think there is a wide consensus that we do not accept a division in our society now. And so who can manage what happened, they should do it in the right way and on the basis of all the legal possibilities we have. But it's not let's say, it shouldn't have a long-lasting impact on our city development. And we are going forward, and we think that we can do this in a similar way we have done already in the past. And maybe from other sources that our philosophy about inclusion is that it has to be based on social security. Mm-hmm. And in this context, housing plays a special role, a real special role. And that means that social security is the basis of social inclusion, that you can participate in the development of the society and culture and so on. And so we can see that the moment that the city or urban development or urbanity really is a combination of hardware and software. Mm-hmm. If you walk at the moment to the city of Vienna, so you are asking where are all the people, because we have something like a second lockdown at the moment. And now concentrate on what? Concentrate on design, or concentrate on people. And we think that housing is, of course, we want to have quality in design and in the development of the areas and so on, but also it needs to have a, let's say, in the social policy or in the social attitude, we have a parallel sister or brother, as you like it. And this means housing is a human right. This is our basis and our basic philosophy. And that means that, and we saw this really along what happened during the COVID period. We have unlimited contracts in our social housing, and this means that 65% of inhabitants of Vienna are covered by social housing. So it's not a philosophy to do it for the poorest of the poor, it's a middle class policy. And so nobody was kicked out because of not being able to pay the rent. Nobody has been kicked out of this group of this type of housing, and I think that this is the important thing, that you can tell the people, okay, we care for you. We are not dividing you. We are not separating you from what's happening in the rich parts of our society. You know? Of course, there are 25 or around 25% of flats are owned by private persons or by private companies, and so on. But this is, I think, the basis to.
Thank you. If I can ask you, how, I mean, you spoke eloquently about hardware and software, and housing is a key. Housing can be a turnkey moment for a local community in terms of creating balanced communities, inclusive communities. But very often you find that private developers work with the local municipality and then just do things without paying attention to the social and inequality dimensions. But have you been using social clauses to make sure that elements of housing go to people who are not able to afford expensive rents or expensive mortgages? Is that how you've done it? And is that politically driven, or how has it happened? People want to know.
So look, we have, let's say we have around 100 years tradition in this type of policy.
Okay,
and
right.
Of course, we have a legal framework which is relevant for all development and all development areas. And that means that the latest steps we did in our legal planning framework is that in every new development area, at least 60% of housing potential has to be organized and constructed in the cost and quality conditions under the cost and quality conditions we have defined for social housing.
So it's something about the DNA of how you've been operating for over 100 years?
Pardon?
So it's part of the DNA of how you've been operating for the past 100 years or so? Is that what you're saying?
No. So the legal framework has been developed step by step the last 100 years.
Okay.
And we are standing on the shoulders of other generations. We started with the Gemeindepower, with social housing and so on. That I wanted to indicate.
Lovely. And I think it'd be useful to know whether, and this is not for you to come back, but to put on the Zoom chat or others will share, if it can be done there, why can't it be done elsewhere? Because when you look at that point that Rosina made about access, but also others have made around, a different way of thinking about balanced communities, which sometimes can be a loaded term, but more inclusion in the kind of using housing as a lever to create that kind of social security or human security, etc., and so forth. I want to thank you very much, Kurt, for your contribution. I want to go to, we have someone from our live stream audience. So, Alex.
Yes,
welcome,
thank you,
Alex.
Darmendra.
Hello. Tell us.
Good morning,
Good
everyone.
morning. Tell us what's one of our, viewers asking.
Yeah, so our Twitter question for today is, how does digitalization change urban planning practice? And will this help or hinder attempts to make cities more inclusive?
Excellent question. That's very, very good. It's a point that has been made. And some of our contributors, if you can think about that, I'll bring one or two of you into that, because one of the things that's happened, and you know this during the COVID times and lockdown times, is that everything's moved online. And, the stocks and shares of our big tech companies have shot through the roof. They're the only ones who've made most money in this crisis. But everyone has moved online in terms of their consumption habits, not only their social habits and interaction, but their consumption habits, and also learning. Amongst other things. So be good to hear from not only our speakers, but those of you in this audience, if you've got something to share around the digital aspect of this agenda. I'd like to invite David or Adelia from our partner organization for this discussion, from Friedrich Neumann Stiftung, to comment on what you've heard and any of the perspectives you'd like to share as a foundation. Is it Adelia who's coming in?
Yes. Good morning. My name is Adelia Breyo from the Friedrich Naumann Foundation in Madrid. First of all, I would like to thank Friends of Europe for the opportunity to co-host this debate. It has been very relevant what the speaker has shared.
Yeah.
And also at the Madrid office, we are implementing the Mediterranean Dialogue Project among more than 10 countries. In the Mediterranean shores, in which integration, migration, and cities development are some of the main topics.
Sure.
So in this line, and taking into account what have been mentioned about women participations in cities designs, and also taking into account that cities are considered the forefront of global effort to find models of economic development and social progress that are sustainable. We have seen among the Mediterranean that there are so many relevant initiatives concerning cities development and inclusion that are still out of public debate. So what I would also like to share and ask our speakers and include this on the debate is, how can we work together to best share this best practice among not only the Mediterranean countries, but maybe in a global level, because we are missing so many interesting and important information and practice from other countries that may be helpful for us to keep developing these projects and initiatives.
Adelia, you make such a good point. You're quite right. We hosted a debate just a week and a half ago with the Anna Lindh Foundation around Euromed cities and the whole issue of integration. And seeing the different dimensions, but there were so many similarities. But what came through was our inability to share and talk to each other about what works, what doesn't work, and being able to move that forward. But what would be good, and not for you to come back directly, but what are you doing from your perspective to connect into some of the networks that we have in Europe, or Eurocities, or the Committee of the Regions, or and others, that you have a number of fora, Cities Alliance for the Climate, etc. How do we get that going in a way that's meaningful and not just, just a quick word here or there, something more structured around sharing information? But I know we've got some people coming in from the European Commission who may be able to shed light on that point. But thank you, and thank you for partnering with us on this debate. And I hope we have other conversations of this nature, because I can tell from the hands that are being raised, there's a lot more interest being generated, and I'm running out of time. I want to go to Letitia Kraus. Your video is off. If you could put it back on. Can you hear me, Lydia? Letitia? Sorry, Letitia. It's because I'm calling the wrong name. No wonder you don't know who I'm speaking to. Letitia Kraus. So your video's off and you're muted. Okay, I'll try and bring you back if I can see that you are not muted and your video's back on. I'm going to move to Desa. Desa Sren?
Yes, thank you very much.
Did I pronounce that correctly?
It's actually Desha, but
Desha.
Anyway, the family name is so difficult to pronounce that
it's a bit like mine. I'm with you in there. So you're from the you're in the cabinet of Sucha, the vice president. So good to welcome and thank you for joining us. What's your question? But also any comment from what you've heard so far in terms of some of the points about digital or what you've just heard about sharing more information? I know you're not. I don't want to put you on the spot, but hey, a public servant is a public servant. There you go.
Thank you very much, and thanks for this invitation. So I'm from the Cabinet of Vice President for Demography and Democracy, and we have published very recently a report on the impact of demographic change. And one megatrend that we have observed is obviously the one of aging and the one of changing households. So my question today is how can actually urban planning help in relation to the inclusion of this aging population that we will have in our cities, because by 2050 or by 2070, a very high percentage of our population will be over 60 and even over 80.
Yeah.
And the question to the architect is how can modern housing solutions help in relation to this intergenerational solidarity, bringing together our older population and this different type of households where you would have just a mother with children, or it's very different from the traditional types of households that we have. And all that specifically in light of COVID, which has shown how elderly population is actually vulnerable to the virus and how protected they must be, which is kind of breaking this intergenerational solidarity that is a motor for any kind of development. So the genuine question is how much this urban planning and new architectural housing solutions can help in relation to this intergenerational solidarity and in relation to coping with the megatrends that will be very much impacting the way Europe will live. Now, I did not enter into digital solutions, but I really wanted to focus on this element of aging, of different types of households.
Okay, sure.
And planning in that specific context.
Okay, as I'm running out of time, I'm not going to push you, but I'd really urge you to. You're in the cabinet of the VP Sucha. What people want to know is how are you responding to your own question? What are you doing? Because she's in a powerful position. Also, what are you doing to help cities really share this information? And we've, your question is one dimension of what Rosina raised earlier about disability and access. It's the same thing. We need to have an inclusive mindset, which means that you're thinking about intergenerational. You're thinking about the fact that actually, if we use foresight more, we know the majority of the world's population is going to be urban. They're all going to be in cities. And Africa's just on the cusp of that wave where we're going to see over 1 billion part of the population in a new agenda of urbanism in Africa. And we've seen in Europe, most of the heavily populated areas are the economic drivers, are cities, but actually we're seeing a huge wave of urbanism and city populations driving a number of socio-economic political issues across Europe and the world. How do we plan for those changes where you're going to have this interconnectedness, but also lack of connection through demographics and poverty and the lack of inclusion? I want to go to Amalia. Amalia Zapal? You're muted, Amalia.
Yeah. Hello.
Hello. Very warm welcome to you. Do introduce yourself. You don't have to have a question. You might have a solution. You might have an idea. Not to set you up like that.
I'm from Athens, Greece. To
Lovely.
Introduce myself. I'm from Athens, Greece. Currently conducting a visiting fellowship at LSE Cities, but never really went to London with all these long lockdowns. I was previously Vice Mayor for Civil Society and Innovation in the municipality of Athens until last year. And at the moment, I'm trying to help the authorities set up a competence center for social innovation to help cities around Greece adopt and incorporate principles of participation and collaboration in the design of the solutions, of their solutions. I put up in the chat box two things that resonated very strongly for us. The one by Hannah is, to what extent does the public sector step up to systemically prepare itself for co-design, what co-design means, which is quite complex. And the second, related to that, from Noor earlier, when she said that we have to simplify the language of design so that more people can participate in it. And it's simplify doesn't mean, it means many different things. It's not only the translation. It's a cultural, I mean, what I find in Athens and Greece is the cultural differences by which people do things together.
Yes.
This co-word is very culturally very relative. So the challenge in these competence centers is to find the Greek way of participation, the local way. And it's not only Greek, it might be just some group of people way. I'm sharing that with you.
Thank you.
But,
and that's really...
I spoke already too much.
No, that's been really...
I have one more questions
Go on.
for the European Commission people, because there's this wave of very interesting programs and funding that is coming to facilitate these things. And to what extent are we all prepared to absorb the knowledge that comes from these calls and the possibility of a public sector to implement them.
Indeed. One of the things that, thank you for bringing all that in. Please do share what you're doing on this, the Social Innovation Centre, because I think others will want to learn from that. And you're quite right that, there is, people say there's a French way, the Greek way, but there's something about the fact that there's a human way, which is that don't treat people as if they're going to compartmentalise their lives in ways that we think they do, but they don't. And actually, culture is ever thus in terms of actually trying to work in ways that take people at their lived reality. And what I mean by that is there are certain concerns about safety, security, access to education, wanting to be able to buy fresh fruit and vegetables at a certain price, wanting to be able to go to school very locally, etc. and so forth. And there's ways in which of engagement which can be pretty universal, but there's a cultural twist, and I totally agree with you in that respect. But do put that on the chat, please. I also want to encourage some of our European young leaders who are in the audience to engage in this debate. And it's interesting what your previous people have been saying, especially Nessa, what you were saying about the intergenerational stuff. There have been some really interesting examples from Finland and elsewhere where, there's been a very different approach to social tenure. So where a block has been created, but younger people are able to get tenure, i.e. a rented apartment, as long as they spend 2 or 3 hours a week speaking to the older people in the block. Now, it might seem like social engineering gone mad, but my goodness, the impact it's had almost immediately when I've read about it and heard the stories is phenomenal. And it's those little things that, building on the experience from Vienna, is that people might see it as social engineering, but it's actually about how do you construct communities of the future and support the dynamics that are taking place as we move ahead. I'm going to bring in and pick on Charles. Charles P. Astolfi, are you with us? One of our European young leaders.
Yes, indeed. Yeah.
Hello, Charles.
Hello.
Share your wisdom. No, your thoughts.
I'm not sure I have much about urban planning. So I'm from France. I'm from the French Digital Council, and maybe a point of consideration is about infrastructure. I deal with network infrastructure a lot, obviously.
Yeah.
And here we're dealing with urban infrastructure, which is a separate and different thing, but that relates in many ways. And maybe a question I was asking myself is, and we've been circling around it since the beginning, is where should we start when it comes to modern urban planning? Should we I feel that in France for the lockdown there's been a lot of top-down decision making.
Yeah.
Not necessarily relating to urban planning, but also we've talked about a lot about co-construction and citizen engagement. What should be the next step? What is the next step we should take in order to do more co-construction and to engage more with citizens.
And how do you respond to the question from our ex-Greek mayor about what is the who and the what in the co-production? And very briefly though, how can digital help? You're the Digital Council. People have mentioned, one of our live stream viewers asked that question. A quick response to that would be really helpful.
So how can digital help? First, you have all the tools that digital can bring, like that definitely helps for digital democracy to create more new forms of engagement, which should not replace other more traditional form of civic engagement, because not everyone has access to a computer,
exactly,
or to internet, obviously. So that's one thing. There probably is some data analysis that can be done at scale today with digital tools, and that was not that we were not able to do like 10 or 20 years ago. And I know that firsthand because a friend of mine who's a civil servant works exactly on that topic. So that's two main areas where I say digital can help.
Okay, great. And one thing you want to reflect, all of you might want to reflect on, and it's something we haven't talked about. This crisis has heralded, and it's one of the same thing, the biggest economic crisis globally and in Europe. And the public bank is bust. We know we are borrowing more money than we have ever in history. And majority of member states and cities are increasingly bust in terms of what they can spend. And it feels like my concern, and see what some of you think, is that this question of inclusion and creating balanced communities or creating communities of the future will land on a deaf ear, because actually it will be about emergency, skills, jobs, and making hand to mouth, because the public bank is bust. And how do you change that dynamic that actually people to make this reference to building back better? And it's one of those phrases that has caught the public imagination, but it's nice to hear, but very little to show for it. I want to bring in Normans Poppens from the European Commission. Normans, thank you for joining us.
Well, thank you. I was going to be in a listening mode today, because normally I speak a lot in these events, because I am in charge of developing urban policy and regional policy.
I'm so glad you've joined us. It's great. Good. You can answer some of the questions. Go on. Sorry.
No, I wanted to come in on the funding specifically because it's linked to the novelties that we have introduced under the cohesion policy to urban. And when we've been funding cities for many years, and we've been trying to improve that, but normally it goes through thematic calls, digital, green, innovation and so on. What we've done in the new period is very important. We have introduced the separate policy objective, which is one of the 5 ones, and the 5th one called Europe Closer to Citizens. Why we did it? Because we realized that we cannot actually channel investment to cities, sometimes to the real needs on the ground in those territories, not just cities, but larger territories, because today we talk about functional urban areas rather than cities. And there are 2 requirements to draw funding from that policy objective in all our programs all over Europe, is to have an integrated development strategy for that particular territory, be it city or larger functional territory, and to design it through the participative approach, to have a discussion at stakeholders level and show that this strategy is the one that is, it has an ownership on the ground. And based on that strategy, then you can draw funding from us, from the ERDF and broader from all cohesion funds, to the right needs. And it can be urban security, it can be, of course, green digital transition, but it can be anything that is a priority for that particular territory, including social inclusion. And there, of course, are different aspects of inclusion. One is that participatory approach, which we also try to promote concretely through our funding instruments. But second is the issues linked to social inclusion, accessibility, how we also involve marginalized groups into our city development and so on. And there, I think we also have more money from the social fund, and we need to use it. Now, the last thing I want to say is how we also build on the solutions found, because we are also running the Urban Innovative Actions instrument, where we are funding currently 86 projects in this period, purely to find innovative solutions on the topics at the heart of a city development. And there is our topics to air quality, to inclusion, to migrant inclusion, to security of public spaces. And there we want to show and we want to capitalize. And of course, in Europe, we have extremely huge number of networks for cities. We have networks for everything for cities. But we have one network, our network, which is linked to cities implementing also our funding and urban innovative actions. And we want to reach out, of course, and we want to popularize these solutions so that they are also picked up and then mainstreamed and maybe funded through our mainstream ERDF programs through that policy objective, which I just mentioned. But I want to say that this capitalization on innovative solutions, participatory approach, the right prioritization on the territorial, on place-based approach is very important, and we will try to promote it through concrete funding instruments. We are also reaching out to Mediterranean. We just finished the action plan for Urban Mediterranean Union, which is one of the kind, because we only have the EU agenda for urban and global, and in the middle we also now have for Mediterranean region. So I think there will be more and more opportunities.
Norman, thank you so much for coming in. I'm glad you decided not to be a bystander, engaged, because the information, no, seriously, because the information you've imparted, most people may not be aware of, okay? And that's what the beauty of what we do is bring all of you together so you're able to learn from each other. What strikes to me...
Check our platform for cities, because there are lots of reports,
of interesting so things. Then, Norman, can I ask you to be helpful and put that on the chat? If you could actually let people know where to go, I think people will find that really helpful. But what occurs to me is that, how do we bring some of the learning you're going to achieve? This is not for you to answer right now, but on the Zoom on the chat, how do you kind of scoop up that learning, or how do you create that cross-fertilization across cities? Because what you're doing sounds very effective. You're creating that magic of using money with a very purposeful objective. And how do you make sure that we're learning that it's actually happening on the ground? I think that's great. And it occurs to me there's probably scope for another event like this, so we can bring it and open it up even more wider than we have thus far. I want to bring back our contributors as I kind of have to come to a conclusion. But if I can say to you, those of you involved in the city design or city planning, or those of you from a locality, please do, put your issue in. And if I can take you in the last minutes or so. But I want to go back to Hannah. Hannah, some comments from you, reflections from you on what you've heard so far on the basis of, it's been very rich, very diverse. Yeah. And obviously we now know the Commission is doing a number of things. But the thing is that you heard from various people about what does co-production really mean? And you know that housing is a turnkey moment for communities, digital, etc. So what's your kind of reflection on what you've heard so far?
I was actually going to pick up on another point you made about cities not being shock absorbent. And I have to say, I disagree. I think what we've seen in the past few months, the record time in which measures have been rolled out in response to the pandemic, and also how many platforms like Eurocities, Metropolis, C40 have set up structures for sharing good practices, for cities to collaborate transnationally. I think this shows how cities are acting and how there is really a political and a society will also for change. But, and this brings me back to a point Tao made during the discussion, is do they have the capacity and the resources? And I think here, in the case of Europe, the support from the Commission is key. And some of you might know that I think last week or 2 weeks ago, a number of cities sent a letter to the Commission and Parliament and Council asking for 10% of the recovery funding to be directly allocated to cities. And I don't think this is going to happen, but I think it is key that that the Parliament and the Commission consider the urgent need of funding and resources at the local level in order to tackle this crisis. And perhaps adding to that, cities themselves also need to look for other opportunities to implement the measures required by either collaborating with other cities in the EU and globally, but also by partnering up with other stakeholders. And this brings me back to the point on co-production. co-production with civil society, but also with the knowledge sector and with the private sector. And we can see this logic already in networks like C40, where private sector funding has been key to rolling out very innovative solutions to, for example, climate change in cities. But I think this model can also be applied to other sectors. Thank you.
Hannah, thank you very much. Thank you for disagreeing with me, because that's good to know. It's very good to know, and useful information. Tao, can I come to you now, based on what you've heard so far and what your opening remarks were, that, you know, you've heard some of the questions that are asked, the kind of mindset issues that need to change. You heard from a number of people around the different dimensions of what we are referring to as, you know, inclusion by design. Your reflections on some of that, Tao?
So I think what's clear to me is that these are not design issues per se. I think they're design issues from the larger context of what design, in line with a whole range of other very necessary things that need to happen prior to design even coming into place, can do. So I think part of what's coming out here for me is there's a multi-dimensional approach that is necessary for us to well use the opportunity we have now. But I would also like to say I'm surprised by what I think is missing in this conversation, which is that not everybody benefits or wants inclusion in whatever form you define it to be at the heart of some of the changes we need to make. So there is going to be resistance from some quarters of society to the changes we're talking about. So it might be helpful as well to, especially for policymakers and all of us doing the kind of work we do, to think about how we prepare ourselves for some of the backlash that comes out of moments like these. Obviously, there's a whole lot of things that one could do about it, but with technology, which you mentioned, it also has shown I think there are lots of examples in the last years, especially about the harm that some of the technology has also done in sort of like embedding some of these conversations. So what I would like to just conclude by saying is that I think there's the multi-dimensional nature of the conversation that we need to embrace, but also there is how do we counter the negatives that usually follow moments like these?
Indeed, indeed, because it will be a question of have and have nots. But as I was saying earlier, the biggest issue is going to be public expenditure. And we know, as I was saying, absolutely without a shadow of doubt, municipalities and national governments are going to be broke and are almost broke across Europe and elsewhere. And how does this agenda feature? And how do we make sure, despite the lovely things that might be happening in networks, when it boils down to it, politicians will make certain decisions based on what they've learned so far, rather than taking a foresight and an enlightened approach. Noor, can I bring you in on that point?
Yeah, I would like also to comment on many interesting points that were brought to the discussion.
Yeah.
I also wanted to comment on disabilities and accessibility from Rosina, also from Desha. I was really lucky in the last 5 years in my practice in Berlin to be involved in many experimental projects in housing, where we were trying to develop new housing typology that you can, from the beginning, design in a way that later can be accessible for everybody. So today, the market need is student apartments or family apartments, but as Desha mentioned, later there will be a complete different structure of the society who would be which would be using this housing, and to decide from the beginning to design and to talk about the economy of space, how much space do we need in these housing elements, and how they can be flexible enough and also accessible enough for certain disabilities, and so is also a decision that we make now, and these experiments needs minimum 20 to 30 years in order to be to see how effective they are. And as also Tao said, there will be so many people who would object to such decision, and it's always a dialogue of if we want to do these decisions or not.
Absolutely. No, the only thing is that when we think about the impact of climate change, okay, and we can see what's going to happen in the next 10 years, 5 years in terms of demographics. We know what's happened on inequalities in terms of sharpening, widening inequalities as a result of the crisis. We don't have 20 to 30 years. You know, frankly, we don't. And there won't be a public policy person they'll be tone deaf to what you're saying completely. So I think we need to find different approaches that galvanize. It's what Tao was saying is that how do you galvanize a lot of you to create enough noise that this is the right thing to do? Because what we've learned politically and socially is that we tend to only act in times of adversity, or we kind of fall into problems rather than actually plan for them and use our foresight to think about the changes that are happening in society, which we know. We'll think about our being progressive societies, that we have data to tell us what's happening in our world, and we know what's around the corner, but we rarely act on it politically. Thank you, Noor, for your comment. I want to bring in finally Kurt. Kurt, any final comments from you based on what you've heard so far? Kurt? You still there? Hi.
I'm back.
Thank you.
Okay. So, look, what I could offer from the city of Vienna, and we did already in the past, is that delegations came to us and we had a profound discussion and information what we have done in the past. And at the moment, we are reduced to this TV sessions, but I always said it's when I was the planning director in the city, I said urban development is the most easiest thing in the world if you have land and money. And this is one of the points of the solution, that governments on the urban level and the city level, they have to care for land. Without land, you cannot build on a social housing procedure. And there are many possibilities to do it. And money, yes, fortunately we have a federal law which which produces an earmarked money for subsidies, and in this combination we can go ahead, and everybody is invited to come and get the information in more detail if you want.
Good, thank you so much, and thank you for that very warm invite to all of us to learn and share. And you break it down to real essentials, is that if you've got land and money, hey, what's the problem? But there's something about the cultural dynamic that's informed by your, as you say, 100-year approach to building a different mindset to how you do things, and the fact that you believe that social housing is an important part of the mix in creating stable, sustainable, inclusive, healthy communities. And actually, that's what we need to have in mind, that we need to think about access differently. We need to think about how digital is going to transform our habits. At the moment, lockdown is changing all of our social habits. We're fortunate enough to have this space, but think how less than 8 months ago we were meeting physically. And our social habits are changing fundamentally. But what we do know is that if we don't tackle the issue of inequality on various levels and access, and we know what's happening in terms of demographic change, and the fact that our younger and older generations will seem even more distant from each other, which will be unhealthy for our communities and our sense of selves as societies. We need to do something urgent, and we need to do something more compelling, and actually not treat this as a luxury and confined to the bit of money that we put aside for the inclusion bit, but actually mainstream it into thinking about, if society is going to be resilient, shock-proof, then actually urban planning has to be, in Kurt's word, I suppose the software to make sure that actually the hardware of a society can actually support inclusive, healthy, sustainable societies. Colleagues, I have to come to an end. We've run out of time. It's been great. Thank you. You've all been so engaging, and it's been a rich conversation. What occurs to me is, if those of you who are interested in continuing this conversation, it occurs to me there's a lot of you here who would benefit next year to really think about, let's say in spring or summer, bringing all of you together into a big bash conversation about what are we doing on this agenda, which looks at both inclusion design, but also integration. If you're interested in that, let us know. Put it on the chat. Thank you, our speakers. Thank you, all of you. Without your contributions and presence, this will be meaningless. So thank you very much from Friends of Europe and our partner, Friedrich Naumann Stiftung, for partnering with us, but also you for being here. Be safe, mind your distance, and take care of yourself. Have a good week. And those of you who want to engage with us again, keep an eye on our website. We have a range of things happening in the next 3 weeks where we're going to be touching upon security. We're going to be looking at digital twin Earth, for example, the capacity of space. And we're going to be looking at a range of things around, whether it's China, whether it's the Mediterranean, and a whole range of others in between. So stay glued to our website if you want to come back to engaging some of our broad conversations that matter to Europe in the future. Thank you all very much for joining us, and see you again. Bye-bye.